She turned my heartbreak into her bestseller, so I turned her bestseller into my movie and rewrote the ending where I finally win. They say heartbreak makes the best stories, but no one tells you what it feels like to be the chapter someone else profits from. My name wasn't in her book, but my life was. Every line, every wound, every night I couldn't sleep. She turned it into fiction, wrapped my scars in metaphors and sold it for hardcover praise. But let me start earlier, before the betrayal had a title. Her name was Eliza Grant. We met at a writing retreat. You know, the kind of place where lost people pretend they're being found. She had messy hair, a loud laugh, and eyes that saw too much. We bonded over insomnia and burnt coffee, shared notes, jokes, and, eventually, grief. Because grief is the fastest way to friendship. It skips introductions and dives straight into secrets. She listened as I told her about my mother's illness, about how I left my job to become a caregiver, about how I watched someone I loved slowly become a stranger, and how no one, not one person, stayed around when it got too quiet. Eliza stayed. She'd sit across from me at that tiny bookstore cafe, with her notebook open, nodding gently, saying things like, "That's powerful. That needs to be written. People would relate to this." I thought she meant me, that I should write it, that I could heal by shaping pain into paragraphs. Turns out I was just the material. 6 months later, I saw her face on a podcast thumbnail, Eliza Grant on her breakout novel, The Silence Between Us. I clicked it without breathing. "It's fiction," she said, "but deeply personal. I drew from real human experiences." Then she laughed. My laugh. The one I shared when I told her how we used to put post-it notes on my mum's medicine bottles so she'd remember what day it was. The podcast host called it genius symbolism, said it showed the decay of memory and identity. I just sat there, staring at the screen. She had taken the most private thing I'd ever lived through and turned it into literature, not as a tribute, not as a thank you, but as a launch pad. The book, it exploded. Critics called it raw and unflinching. Book clubs dissected every chapter. She went on a tour, panels, interviews, a Netflix pitch. My story was a subplot in someone else's success story. And me? I wasn't even credited in the acknowledgements. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was the performance. How she cried on stage reading Chapter 7, the chapter about a son begging a nurse not to sedate his mother during a lucid moment. I remember that night. It happened. To me. I still have the voicemail from the hospital. She changed the names, changed the ending, made it poetic, made it hers. I tried telling a few people, friends, old classmates. They said, "Well, you never wrote it down. You didn't copyright your pain. At least it's being told." That's when I realized people don't care who lived the story. They only care who packaged it. And Eliza, she was great at packaging. While I was still grieving, she was printing advance copies. While I was trying to find peace, she was negotiating film rights. One night, I sat with her book on my lap. I wanted to burn it, rip it apart, shout, but instead I underlined every passage that was mine. Page 43. The exact words I'd said during our third night talking. Some days I feel like I'm grieving someone who's still breathing. Page 77. My mother's last sentence changed slightly. Tell the moon I remember its shape. Page 114. A poem I wrote in a notebook she borrowed. Word for word. She didn't just borrow my story. She extracted it. And still, I didn't confront her. Not then. Because revenge done right doesn't show up angry. It shows up quiet. I made one decision that night. I wasn't going to take her book down. I was going to bury it beneath my version. The real version. The one no one had read yet. Not even her. She may have taken my pain to write her novel, but I was going to take her novel and rewrite the ending. Not in a book, but on a screen, where the whole world could see what happens when you mistake someone's pain for your plot device. I didn't post about it, didn't tweet, didn't call her out, because the best kind of rebuild is the one no one sees coming. While she was on stage collecting awards, I was in a one-bedroom apartment, collecting evidence. Every passage that mirrored my memories, every recording, email, handwritten note she once said she borrowed for inspiration. I kept everything, not out of bitterness, out of precision, because when you're planning a comeback, details matter more than drama. I started working nights at a small indie production house. Nothing flashy, nothing headline worthy, but I watched, listened, learned how pitch decks worked, how rights got optioned, how stories moved from paper to screen. I offered to write coverage notes for free, just so I could read scripts and learn what sold, and more importantly, what didn't, because I knew something Eliza didn't. She had a bestseller, but the story, it wasn't finished, not to me. I didn't want to sue her, didn't want to cancel her. I wanted to outlast her, so I kept my head down. Day job at a publishing firm, night job in film development, weekends rebuilding my own manuscript. This time, not for a book, but for a screenplay, not just my story. The truth, my version was quieter, less lyrical, more real, because the truth doesn't need metaphors, it needs moments, the kind you remember at 3 a.m., the kind that don't sell copies, but change hearts. I called it Unwritten Silence. No big reveal, no twist ending, just a man trying to make peace with a world that clapped louder for the person who stole his story than for the one who survived it. It took me 9 months to finish, another 2 to revise, and when I was ready, I didn't send it to agents. I sent it directly to an acquisitions manager I knew at a mid-tier studio, one I'd fetched coffee for, taken notes for, sat beside at too many development meetings. He called me back 3 days later. "This is real," he said. I didn't say anything, because real pain doesn't need a pitch. It just needs a place to land. 6 weeks later, he called again. "We're in." I asked him one thing. "Who owns the screen rights to the silence between us?" He paused. "Eliza's rep sold it 2 years ago. Studio shelved it after creative differences." I nodded. "Can you find out who has it now?" He chuckled. "You trying to beat her to the punch?" "No," I said quietly. "I'm trying to fix the ending." By the time the deal was signed, I didn't just own the rights to my screenplay. I now owned the rights to hers, and when I got that email with the confirmation, I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just sat there, finally in control of the story that was never hers to begin with. The rights were tangled in a holding deal. 2-year clause, creative freeze, no green light unless a rewrite was approved. Perfect. Because what Eliza didn't understand was this. The industry forgets books, but it remembers screenplays. She thought her story was locked, immortalized between hardcovers and fan reviews. But publishing and film, 2 different worlds, one fueled by words, the other by control. My legal rep asked me twice, "Are you sure you want to buy the rights to both?" I didn't flinch. "Yes." "Even hers?" "Especially hers. See, when you own the story, you control the ending. You decide who lives, who dies, what gets erased, what never makes it to the screen." And when I signed those documents, it wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I didn't need to destroy her novel. I just needed to outlive it. So while her team tried to renegotiate a streaming option, I declined, quietly, legally, completely. "No interest in pursuing that direction," I said. The deal died on arrival, and the door closed without a sound. A few weeks later, Eliza's name popped up in the trades again. Author hints at big screen adaptation of best-selling novel. I didn't call anyone, didn't correct the headline, because by then her agent had already received a quiet letter from me, politely stating that any use of her novel on screen, in part or in whole, would be a breach of contract. Ownership, after all, is not about noise. It's about leverage. She didn't reach out. Not directly, but I saw the shift. Her tweets stopped mentioning film deals. Her interviews got quieter. She started promoting side projects, avoiding questions about screen adaptations. Because in her heart, she knew. She'd taken my pain and turned it into a paperback empire. But now, I own the stage she was never invited to step on. I didn't just buy the rights to her story. I bought her platform, the part she thought no one could touch, because writers don't always understand the business side. But I did. I understood contracts, options, shelf clauses, royalty logs, and I used every inch of it, not to erase her name, but to redefine its value. The studio wanted both scripts side by side. Hers, poetic, dramatic, romanticized. Mine, Restrained, stripped down, honest. I let the executives decide. They read both, and 3 days later, they called with one sentence: "We're moving forward with yours." There was no applause, no Instagram live, no passive-aggressive quotes in her next essay, just a sudden silence from her camp, the kind of silence that only comes when someone realizes they bet on the wrong story. The theatre wasn't massive, no red carpet, no media circus, just a private screening with select press, key investors, and an invite list curated by me. She wasn't on it, but her silence online told me she knew something was coming, just didn't know what. The trailer had dropped a week prior. No title from her book, no credits with her name, just a new name, a new writer, me. The film opened with the same scene she stole from my life, but this time it ended differently. Not with heartbreak, not with failure, not with the protagonist quietly fading into the background, but with clarity and choice and control. It wasn't vengeance, it was correction. I sat in the back row, alone, not to hide, but because that's where I started, in the shadows, on the edge of her spotlight, watching her shape my life into sentences she could profit from. But this time, the spotlight was mine, and it wasn't warm, it was sharp. As the credits rolled, people didn't cheer. They stood, slowly, thoughtfully, because this story wasn't designed for applause. It was designed to linger, to make people sit in their own silence the way I once sat in mine while she signed copies of the story she didn't ask permission to tell. Later that night, a journalist asked, "Is it true this film is based on the same events as Eliza's novel?" I smiled gently. "Only one of us lived it." That's all I said. That's all I needed to say. By morning, her publisher had removed the "in talks for a screen adaptation" line from her bio. Her book club appearances, cancelled. PR team, silent. Because once the world sees the real version of a story, the ghost-written fantasy fades fast. I didn't ruin her career. She did. When she thought my pain was a tool for her prestige, when she thought authorship meant ownership. But I didn't write a better story to beat her. I wrote it to reclaim me. And now, her name is a footnote. Mine's on the marquee. I used to think revenge would feel like fire, like storms and headlines, like the world finally watching while she squirmed. But now I know it feels quieter, like peace, like sitting in the back row of a theater and hearing someone whisper, "That felt real," because that story was finally told by the person who lived it. I don't walk into rooms needing validation anymore. I don't chase credits or recognition. I just build, not to prove anything, but because creation outlasts noise, and the people who tried to steal your light, they burn out trying to catch their own reflection in it. There are still nights I open the old draft, the one she published, the version where I was broken and small and unfinished. I read the ending she wrote for me, the one where I never got back up, where heartbreak was the final scene. And then I flipped to the script I rewrote, the ending I earned, where grief became growth, where silence turned into authorship, where the character didn't die in the wreckage. They rebuilt the whole damn city. People think legacy is about what you leave behind. Trophies, titles, books on a shelf. But real legacy is what changes in people because you refuse to stay silent. It's the reader who finally speaks, the watcher who finally heals, the writer who finally realizes they don't need someone else to tell their story. She taught me something, that stories have power, that authors have reach, and that if you're not careful, someone will take your pain and sell it with a fake smile. But she also taught me this, that stolen stories can be reclaimed, that endings aren't owned by publishers, and that truth, no matter how delayed, always finds a mic. My name isn't in lights, but it's in the right rooms, and hers is fading from the pages, because when the final chapter is written, it won't be about who told the story first. It'll be about who told it right.